Well, I welcome the Labour Plaid Cymru budget, and Stephen Lewis gave a list of the changes as are due to the influence of Plaid Cymru. The DUP in Northern Ireland has got an extra billion for Northern Ireland out of their support for the government at Westminster, and Plaid Cymru has managed to redirect 500 million out of the 15 billion that the Labour government here has to spend, and I've got no objection to any of the changes which have been made, because that's what coalition types of arrangements are about, and nobody therefore can complain about the way in which the DUP has used its position at Westminster, because it's happening here in Cardiff in the same way. What would be quite interesting, of course, to know is what the government would have spent the 500 million on if they hadn't been in hock to Plaid Cymru. Then we would be able to have a proper debate on priorities, which is what the Finance Committee recommended. We need to know much more about the government's priorities and how they conform to the spending plans which they've announced. And in this context, I would like to thank the chairman of the Finance Committee, who speaks for me in this respect, if on no other, for the exemplary way in which he's chaired the committee, and indeed the unfailing courtesy of the Finance Secretary in his appearances before us towards all members. There is a certain air of unreality about these budget debates, as I pointed out in my speech on the draft budget, inasmuch as the Finance Secretary is constrained by the expenditure which is inevitable. The scale of discretionary spending is actually quite small, although that should increase in years to come when we start exercising our power over devolved taxes and also have a relatively limited but nevertheless important power to borrow for spending on capital projects. But what has happened in this budget, by and large, is that the health budget has been increased at the expense of everything else. And that, I suppose, in a way is inevitable as well, because, as we know, health inflation is greater than the rate of inflation generally. We have an ageing population, and with advances in medical science, more conditions become treatable, people live longer, so there's inevitably going to be a huge increase in the health budget at UK level and in the Welsh budget. So I have enormous sympathy with the Finance Secretary in his difficult task of having to reconcile all the claims upon him. But it is interesting that some budgets have been cut by much more than others. I mean, the environment budget has taken a particularly big hit of something like 15% in real terms. Whilst the health budget has gone up only a small amount in percentage terms, but nevertheless, of course, it's as part of a very large budget, a significant sum of an extra £166 million. And all that is very welcome. But what is troubling about the health service in Wales is not so much the amount of money which we're spending on it, but the laxity of some of the health boards in what they do with the money that they're given. And we know the problems of the deficits which are in existence at the minute, and particularly in Hywel Dda and Betsy Cadwaladr. And Betsy Cadwaladr bumps along. 2 years ago, it had a significant deficit that came down. Now this year it looks as though it's going up again. So we don't seem to be making a great deal of progress in that respect. And until we get the problems of the health boards, which are in special measures or targeted intervention, properly under control, this is going to be an intractable problem for the Finance Secretary. There are other issues which I think we should turn our attention to. I've been particularly interested to look at the amount of money which is spent on enterprise zones. I think enterprise zones are a very good idea, and they do have a capacity to kickstart the economy in areas which have got otherwise very long-term problems. But when you look at how many jobs have actually been created or safeguarded relative to the amount of money which has been spent on them, we have to ask ourselves whether this is value for money. That's not to say I want to cut off these sums, but what I would like to see is we get more bangs for our buck, as it were. To take the Ebbw Vale enterprise zone, for example, ignoring the vast costs of the Heads of the Valleys road development, which would be included in the expenditure in that area. If we look back to the pre-2016 position, we had about 400 jobs in total that were created or safeguarded in Ebbw Vale at a cost of nearly £20 million. Now, I don't think that's terribly good value for money, and go through the rest of the enterprise zones as well. Some are doing a lot better than others, and job creation costs are much better in some than others. So I think we really need to look in greater detail at whether we are getting value for money out of these projects, because although the idea behind them is certainly laudable, we need to ask ourselves whether they are actually performing for us. One other element of the budget, which Nick Ramsey referred to a moment ago, actually, was about prevention. And, of course, there's tremendous pressure to spend upon current needs, but if we are to cut costs or to improve performance in the longer term, we have to take the longer term view. And we discussed this with the Future Generations Commissioner in the Finance Committee, and I know it's difficult for the Finance Secretary, so I'm not unaware of the conundrum that he has to solve, but we do need to spend more upon looking ahead to future problems and anticipating them, and hence reducing the future costs which are going to press in upon us. We've had the usual complaint about so-called austerity, of course, and I've many times responded to this, in the Chamber, with a national debt now approaching £2 trillion, compared with the trillion that it was only 5 years ago. Nobody can credibly say that the Westminster government has been doing anything other than spraying money at the economy. The problem is that very often it's been spent on the wrong things. And again, I've gone through that in the past. I don't intend to repeat myself today. But the borrowing requirement this year is nearly £50 billion, compared with £83 billion last year. The national debt is 85.6% of GDP this year. That's 0.3%. That's 3% higher than it was in 2015-2016. The national debt is still rising, and it is rising as a proportion of GDP, and that means, looking ahead to future generations, that this is a millstone around the neck of children and grandchildren and beyond. Of course, borrowing goes up and down over the cycle, but we're now in the 10th year after the financial crisis of 2008, and we should really have made much more progress in cutting borrowing than we have done, because you can't just borrow forever. Venezuela is now discovering this, as Zimbabwe and many other countries around the world have, and indeed Britain discovered in the 1970s. Indeed, after every Labour government, there is usually to be found a significant economic problem which has to be solved. And I don't absolve the Conservative government from some of the blame here, but the truth of the matter is, as Nick Ramsey pointed out in response to Mick Anthony earlier on, that after 13 years of Labour government to 2010, they squandered the legacy which was left by Kenneth Clarke. After the first Blair administration, they took off the brakes on spending. The result was, instead of mending the roof when the sun was shining, we found we had great gaping holes in it at a time when the rain was coming down in torrents after 2000. I will, certainly. Yes. I mean, that point is just factually incorrect. The actual percentage of borrowings compared with GDP at the time of the financial crisis was 37.2%, about 0.2% higher than it was when Labour came into government in the first place. The only difference was the increase to 50%, which was effectively the steps taken by Gordon Brown to actually save the UK economy from collapsing. What you've had now as a result of austerity measures under this Tory government and the cutback in capital investment is, in fact, the percentage is now 88%. Well, I think if the member examines the record, he will find that under the first Blair government, they reduced the proportion of debt in GDP up to 2001, and from 2001 to 2010 it rose steadily every year until the explosion after 2008. I haven't got the figures with me today, but I'll be happy to send them. He'll find them in the House of Commons Library research paper, which gives them. So that's the reality of the background to the budget. So we can't just magic away the macroeconomic problems which the UK faces, and if we attempt to do so, then we will make things even worse for us in the future. And what we need to do is to grow the economy. In the United States now, of course, there are plans for substantial reductions in corporation tax. This is being mirrored in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Switzerland. This is what we need for Britain. I'm very much in favour of devolving corporation tax to Wales so that we can take our own course in this respect as well. But I appreciate that that's a debate for another day. So whilst I welcome the budget, I recognise the limitations that the Finance Secretary is bound by. I think there are things that we can do to tweak things at the margins, but his scope for action is very little more than that.
Mike Hedges.
Thank you, President.